So here's where I'm going to attempt to lighten it up a little bit. Sorry about the scariness there. And I do see a few questions scrolling through, and I will absolutely get to that as soon as I can. But I want, from a more systemic point of view, to start helping people understand the difference between, say, affirmation and inclusion, right? I've worked at many clinics that, in many schools that have the rainbow stickers, the safe space stickers. As we all know, there are plenty of performative marketing efforts that are across the globe during, say, Pride Month. Just about everything turns into a rainbow for the month of June on our television screens at this point, which, don't get me wrong, that's awesome. It's great to see that representation, but when it stops there, that's where we struggle. That's where it's being affirmative, but not necessarily inclusive. Especially when you start diving a little bit deeper into some of those organizations or brands, and you see that their money is not exactly where their mouth is, shall we say. Plenty of examples would, be having a DEI position that has basically no systemic power to change anything whatsoever. It's a performative 1 or 2 person hire. There's a little bit of feel-good stuff going on, but really no systemic change across the organization or clinic. And you can see that there's a lack of diversity in the staff. What you're encountering is, just a whole lot of window dressing and not a whole lot of actual change and depth in what we're talking about. Now, the opposite of that would be inclusion, right? Which also includes equity. It's making sure that from a clinical and mental health standpoint, shall we say, that some, at least, of our staff and clinicians, and preferably leadership, are LGBTQ plus individuals, especially individuals of color. That we make sure that the forms that we're using, I couldn't help but see that one. It's diversity, equity, and inclusion, Margaret. The forms that we're using are inclusive, not only in language, but in some of the smaller details. For example, when taking a medical history, some places will diversify on a binary level, right? Things that males would encounter from a medical standpoint, things that females would encounter from a medical standpoint. That form is going to make me really uncomfortable as a trans person, because it's possible that I don't want to out myself to this particular clinic. I don't want to put myself at that risk. Making sure that the language we use on the phone, when we greet a room of people at a presentation, instead of using ladies and gentlemen, we're using hey folks. Making sure that the language our support staff uses on the phone is also inclusive, that the questions we're asking, instead of, oh, who's your husband, asking whether or not they have a partner. When going sexual history, same thing. Whether or not they have a sexual partner, what is the gender of that sexual partner? Just to give you some limited examples on how to be a little bit more inclusive there. And going beyond the now fairly popular annual DEI training for cultural humility. And in cases of education, going beyond that level of, we get one multicultural class in our entire graduate program unless we choose to specialize in an area, and knowing that that's not enough to train our clinicians, and knowing that sending your clinicians to, a handful of CEUs once a year to keep their licenses up, that doesn't really, it's helpful, but that's not inclusivity. So looking at organizational leadership, and it does start with leadership. We need our agencies, especially in clinical or community mental health, to take a look at themselves from the top down. Our leadership needs to make sure that they're addressing their own internal biases and making sure that they have their own level of cultural awareness about themselves and who they are and where they come from, because that's what broadens your perspective to begin to understand other cultures that you aren't as familiar with and identities that you aren't as familiar with. And it starts with that leadership setting the tone for their organization. And I don't care if that's a clinical organization or an organization such as a school, whether it's the school board, or whether it's a hospital organization, a residential home. You get the point. Even a brand, any kind of organization that is employing individuals, because you never know who you're employing and what they need. Making sure that your policies are anti-harassment and anti-discrimination, not just in letter, but also in spirit, and that you're kind of walking the walk as you talk it. Again, don't stop at a performative level of just doing that annual inclusivity training, or, we've all been through that. I even groan my eyes at those, and roll my eyes. You sit down and it's this forced upon you training, and it just feels awkward and awful. And inevitably, in my experience as an out clinician, for the most part, every single one of those live trainings has called me out to ask me a question without my permission and without my knowledge beforehand. And basically that leaves me feeling as the token trans person in the room who can speak to a subject. Now, that sounds a little weird given the fact that I'm standing here speaking to a subject, but this was of my own volition, and that is just being pulled into a situation as the token person. That's not inclusive. It's actually potentially dangerous. Making sure that your staff and your customers, clients, consumers have a very clear and inclusive reporting process that protects them before it protects your brand or your entity. Now, that's probably a little bit radical, but we don't have a CMH or a company or whatever the case is without the people that we serve. So I just want people to understand that it sounds a little bit like the customer's always right, and that's not necessarily the case. We're looking to protect the people we serve because they're the most vulnerable people. And our brand or organization will make it through. But we need to make sure that the people we serve are making it through. Your hiring practices need to be diversified. You need to make sure that that's, again, not just a performative aspect, that there's not just a token trans guy somewhere on your staff, but that you're actually actively recruiting LGBTQ, especially people of color, and that you're recruiting diversely across your community. If you live and work in a completely straight, white, cis, het environment, chances are your staff is going to be majority cis, white, and het. If you happen to live and work in a place such as I do, which is an incredibly rural but incredibly diverse community with over 30 languages spoken in our school district of 3,000 students, the staff, the teachers, the leadership needs to reflect the community that we're serving. And so far, for us at least, that's still a work in progress. Making sure that you're attending trainings and looking for the outreach that you need to get to those hiring practices that are going to make it more able for you to have a diverse presentation of staff. And let me also say on a conference standpoint, when we, as someone who does trainings, not only like this, but also in consultation trainings where I try to help organizations understand this a little bit better and really put this into practice, making sure that you're trying to tap into willing LGBTQ folks, especially people of color and multiple or diverse backgrounds, to do these types of work, to do this type of training. And that goes a little bit against, some of the don't make us do all the work, step up and be an ally kind of mentality. And that is true. Please don't get me wrong. That is very, very true. I do not want, like the example I just gave, where I'm being called out in a training to give some sort of expertise because I happen to be the LGBTQ person in the room. That is not on the good end of having us do the work. My being able to have my own authority to come into a situation like this and choose to do a presentation like this, or choose to do some of the trainings that I actively seek out and get hired for, absolutely. That is me intentionally putting myself out there and at risk in order to make sure that you have a voice that is inclusive of the people that we're trying to write the policies for. So I just wanted to make that differentiation real quick. Making sure that you're putting your organization's power, whatever that may be, but from a clinical perspective especially, into your local and regional advocacy efforts. And again, this has to go beyond putting a rainbow sticker up or waving a pride flag during the month of June. It needs to be where you have round the year support services. And I'm coming mainly from either an education, public schools, or a community mental health standpoint when I'm talking about this. Making sure that you offer support groups to trans and LGBTQ folks. Making sure that the people offering those groups are appropriately trained, and preferably, like I am, a willing member of the community, if at all possible. Making sure that you're offering those safe spaces, making sure that your leadership is going to the local government and the regional governments and really advocating for the safety of all of your clients and consumers, not just some, and certainly not just the majority. And I would encourage you as an organization and as leaders of organizations and as clinicians in the room with vulnerable populations, I would encourage you to not avoid the uncomfortable. As I tell a lot of my recovery clients who are working on their addiction and trying to get to a point where they're feeling more free, if you're uncomfortable, you're probably doing it right. So again, just a little blurb on inclusive language. I didn't transition until I was approximately 40 years old. So that's close to 10 years ago now. And having the experience of being raised and perceived largely as a white passing female for the majority of my life, I too was socialized under a lot of the language that we see here in the red. And as somebody approaching depressingly half a century, even as a trans person, I still struggle to make sure that I'm using more inclusive language. So I have a great deal of compassion for folks that also struggle with this, but I also have to own the fact that it's up to me to get used to things and to make things inclusive on my end. It's not up to me to ask for forgiveness or to ask for patience. If I can learn my uncle's married name, you can learn mine right off the bat. So, that understanding and compassion and empathy, really professionally speaking, can only go so far. We have to get it right because we don't know what's going to hurt our client. And not every client is out. Not everyone's comfortable. So it doesn't hurt us to use colleagues instead of ladies and gentlemen. It doesn't hurt us to say orientation instead of preference, because I guarantee you it was never my preference to become a walking, moving target in my professional and personal lives. That is not a preference to me. I would not have chosen this as a life. And I just want people to try and understand that, please.